Thank you. And today I'm going to talk about the rise of containers and the future of app development. And I felt a little bit arrogant about this title, that the future of app development is containers and so on. And then yesterday, totally unprompted, Eric Brewer, the great Eric Brewer, who is the inventor of the CAP theorem, also known as Brewer's theorem, had an interview with Scale in which he said the future of computing is containers. I'm like, all right, Brewer has given me his stamp of approval, so I feel I'm no longer being arrogant, or at least no more arrogant than he's being. So I want to talk about the future of application architecture, but to talk about the future, I want to actually first go back into the past. And let's talk about application architecture circa the last bubble, 2000. And yes, that's right, bubble. And for those of us who lived through it, we know what it's like. The apocalypse is coming, but let's enjoy it. Enjoy the conference while it lasts, of course. But back in the last bubble, in 2000, we had these internet scale architectures, three-tier architectures. We called them a bunch of different things, model view controller and so on. We kind of built these things out with these three tiers. You had this view tier, you had the controller tier that sat in the middle, you had the model tier that sat in the back. The database, you had the app logic, and you had PHP or what have you on the front end. And that was fine, and we built these things out, and it was good. And then in the mid-2000s, we actually, tip of the hat to Google, started realizing that there was actually a real programming language sitting in the web browser, JavaScript. And we had the rise of AJAX. There's an acronym that has been lost to time, right? If you're playing the AJAX drinking game, you haven't been drinking very much recently, so I will now instruct you to drink with the mention of AJAX. AJAX is the asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Terrible acronym. One of the letters stands for a conjunction. One of the letters is an abbreviation. Anyway, but the AJAX revolution allowed us to build a real application on the web browser. We use the browser to actually build a real app, and we use REST, another bad acronym, but a good idea, representational state transfer, to build strong APIs that would talk to these things over the web. And do you remember that moment with, you guys are software developers, I assume? Do you remember that moment when you first discovered that JavaScript was a real language and having all those kind of conflicting feelings? I had a lot of conflicting feelings because I went into this thinking, boy, I'm the first computer scientist to actually look at this language. You're like, oh my God, I actually think I like this language. In fact, I think I might love it. It's like the forbidden love for somebody with a computer science degree to actually fall in love with JavaScript. A lot of conflicting feelings, but realizing that actually you could go build a very powerful system this way, and it led to some broader architectural questioning. Namely, why is HTTP restricted to web apps? And of course, this conference is a hallmark and shows us that HTTP need not be restricted to web apps. REST need not be restricted to web apps. And instead of having one gigantic monolith, this kind of J2EE monstrosity, why not have a bunch of smaller services that all speak HTTP and have these REST endpoints, and then we can string these smaller services, these well-defined services, together in novel ways to do interesting and exciting things. Like I was watching some of the demos during lunch. You can string these services together to have your doctor record your conversation, right? You can do interesting things. And in case this sounds vaguely familiar, it's like, that seems small, well-defined things. Yes, that's the Unix philosophy, right? This is the Unix philosophy, and this is probably the most important contribution to systems thinking. The Unix philosophy as articulated by Doug McIlroy. So we think of Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie as being the inventors of Unix, but really Doug McIlroy is the true inventor of Unix, because it is really Doug McIlroy who gave us the philosophy that guided Unix. And this philosophy, verbatim from the 70s, is that we are going to write programs that do one thing and do it well. We're going to write programs that work together. And we are going to write programs that handle text streams, because that is a universal interface. As systems engineers, as people that build and deploy systems, this is the equivalent of our Talmud. This is like biblical. This is stuff that you should read to your children. I'm sure they won't appreciate it. If your children are like my children, they'll have zero appreciation for it. And they'll still want to grow up to be baseball players, despite the fact that they're actually going to learn something for once, damn it. But this is an incredible philosophy, and you should use it to guide your own development. Indeed, many of us have, many of you do, because this is, I believe, the single most important revolution in software systems thinking. If you apply it to HTTP-based services, what do you get? You get microservices. right? Microservices are really nothing more than taking these proven ideas of the Unix philosophy and applying it to HTTP-based services. And we're going to replace these huge monoliths with these little smaller services that we can then compose to do new and interesting things. Now, how many of you have a little bit of an allergic reaction to microservices, if any? I know microservices has become a popular term. It's like this called no-ops thing. And some people have a little bit of an allergic reaction to it. And indeed, Kelly Summers, terrific technologist, tweeted this a few months ago about her frustration with the term microservices. And I assume that Kelly is flying into this rage that must look familiar to you. Basically, my interview question is just to show that little video. And if that rage does not look familiar to you about something, you're not a technologist I can work with. Rage is ultimately the binding force for actual software engineers. It is the rage that you feel that actually binds us together more than anything else. And so, and Kelly's rage is around microservices, and I think I understand why. I think that the idea of microservices becomes like this, oh, I can just spray paint microservices on this and magic happens. It becomes this euphemism, this managerial euphemism for magic. And it's obviously not that. But I do think, and I know Kelly thinks, that the microservices, the ideas behind it are actually sound and real, even if we're getting a little bit over our skis. So, but in terms of developing the microservices, if you look at modern environments, Node.js, Go, they are actually a perfect fit for microservices. And you can argue, what is kind of feeding what, but I actually think that Unix philosophy, that desire to build these smaller, well-defined services, is feeding this desire for these environments. Node.js, JavaScript on the server, we obviously use that a lot at Joyent. Go, pioneered by Google, and these things have a light memory footprint. They've got first-class asynchrony. Yes, the way that Go and Node do it are different, but fundamentally they both have first-class asynchrony, and they both express that Unix programming model cleanly into the environment. Both of these actually environments are effectively the embodiment of the Unix philosophy in terms of a programming language. One, not at all by accident. Go from Rob Pike and Ken Thompson, so it can trace that lineage directly. Node.js probably a little bit more of an accident of history, but they both actually embody the Unix philosophy. So that's in terms of how we develop them, and many people, and we saw it on stage, people are developing in Go and Node a lot today, other languages too, but those are a particularly good fit for developing microservices. In terms of deploying microservices, how do we deploy microservices? Well, they're tautologically small, right? If your microservice is not small, hey, newsflash, not a microservice, that's a macro service. That's a big old monolithic service. If your microservice is not small and well-defined, then it's actually not a microservice. And clearly, obviously, we're not going to have a single physical machine per microservice. We're a long way from that. But how are we actually going to deploy these things? At what level of abstraction, if we're not going to have one physical machine for a microservice, how are we going to run multiple microservices on a single piece of physical or virtual hardware? And the key, obviously, is to virtualize, but the question is, at what layer of the stack do we virtualize? And this is a very important question, because this drives density. This drives economics. And even if you are a software engineer, if you studied computer science, you should know that economics ultimately trumps us all. Economics is not necessarily worthy of study when you're an undergraduate, but it does actually trump everything. Economics ultimately takes no prisoners, and it is economics that will drive the decision here. So we have to be very mindful of where we virtualize. All right, so how are we going to do this? Well, the historic way to do this is hardware-based virtualization. And this has been the answer since the 1960s. And actually, the idea here is that software is going to present a virtual machine, and then upon that virtual machine, you're going to put a virtual operating system that is totally fooled. It's got no idea that it's actually on a virtual machine. And the history here is actually interesting. The history here goes back to the mid-60s, and IBM was developing one of the most important computing systems in history, the System 360. And the System 360 was going to unify all of these disparate instruction set architectures, the IBM 1401, the IBM 650, the IBM 1620. This is a long time ago. And IBM had this beautiful instruction set architecture, and good news, you get to rewrite your software in our beautiful instruction set. Well, it's amazing that even in the mid-60s, even shortly after the dawn of computing, software had more inertia than hardware. And people were not so into rewriting their software for this new beautiful instruction set. And into this kind of gap where IBM is peddling the 360 and people are still on the 1401 and older machines, into this gap comes Honeywell. Yes, they used to make something other than thermostats. Honeywell made computers, and Honeywell had a machine called the H200, and they realized they could develop software for the H200 that made it look like a 1401. And in classic, you can't make this up, mid-60s fashion, they called it the Liberator. It's like, I miss the Cold War so much. I know that many of you are too young to remember the Cold War, and as a result, you know nothing. It's not your fault. I miss the Cold War. It gave us so much kind of certainty, and the Liberator is something we would call either software or an ICBM. Anyway, so we had the Liberator software, and the 1401, or the H200, starts flying off the shelves. IBM kind of figures this out, and they develop 1401 emulation for the 360, and that continued actually for many, many years. In fact, one of the most shocking moments in my career was sitting with the CIO of a major Wall Street bank circa Y2K, talking about the Y2K problems, and he said, you know what, 45% of our Y2K problems came from a single platform. And I'm kind of at the edge of my seat. He said, the IBM 1401. I basically had a stroke. The IBM 1401 running in production since the 60s. This is ridiculous. But it shows us the permanence of software. And if you've got ancient software that you need to run, if you are on the Antiques Roadshow of computing systems, hardware virtualization is exactly what you want. Hardware virtualization allows you to not only embrace the past, but live in it. It's great. Okay, so let's just run this everywhere. Well, there's a catch. The catch is you've got this layer of goo sitting between your app and the hardware. And anytime you want to do something, you're going to talk to a virtual operating system that's going to talk to an actual operating system. And by the way, multiple operating systems doesn't make anything any faster, right? Nothing's even sped up by this. And it really impedes tenancy in particular, because that hypervisor, that low level of software, can't see that application. And so when you ask for a virtual gig of DRAM, that hypervisor has got no idea how much of that gig of DRAM is actually being used versus being used by that guest operating system. The guest operating system, meanwhile, believes that it actually has a gig of DRAM. It's totally lied to. It's living in the past, remember? So it really impedes tenancy. You're like, wow, okay, I get it. Jesus, as my 10-year-old says, okay, we get it. Okay, you get it. Like, who would run this way? Answer, all of us. If you are deploying on Amazon today, if you are deploying on Zen today, VMware today, you are in IBM 1401 land. You are deploying a virtual machine and putting a virtual operating system on top of that machine and then an app on top of that operating system. And you don't see that because that's baked into an AMI and so on, but that is the layer of abstraction. And then when you do see it is when the performance sucks. Like, wow, the I/O performance is really terrible. It's like, you're lucky this works at all. Do you have any idea how complicated this is? I mean, we've got walruses mating underneath you, and you're complaining about the performance. But okay, so then you kind of settle down. You're like, okay, no, settle down. They didn't know. But the problem is there's no way around it because the abstraction itself is in the way. Okay, so hardware virtualization does not work for microservices, especially because the overhead dominates, does not make sense. Okay, what about platform level virtualization? Let's go all the way up the stack. Okay, and this is great, platform level virtualization. You give developers what developers love, these abstractions that feel oh so nice, but it's kind of like eating candy. Boy, it's delicious, but it's really not good for you. It can't represent the entirety of your diet. Because you find that when you want to go scale something out, you want to go build the service, you want to exceed the bounds that the platform as a service actually envisioned. And it's not that it's hard, it's that it's impossible. It's like, oh, no, you just have to rewrite your app if you want to do that. It's like, oh, no. Don't rewrite your app. And this is what I would call the Google App Engine problem. Google App Engine, terrific in a lot of ways, and it's great for Hello World apps, it's great for toy apps, not so great for real apps, because real apps tend to outgrow the constraints that were envisioned for that. So that doesn't really work. Sophisticated applications are really difficult and can be impossible, and there are a lot of other challenges too. So platform level virtualization is too high, hardware level virtualization is too low. Of course, OS level virtualization is just right. In OS level virtualization, you've got a single operating system kernel, one OS. That OS presents to each tenant, presents to each application a virtual system call table that looks and feels and smells like its own OS, like it is alone in the universe. But it is actually sharing one OS kernel. You don't have operating systems on top of operating systems. And as a result, you get much better performance. You go to do I/O, it's just like doing I/O. You don't have this unnecessary guest operating system. You get much better tenancy. You get much better density. You ask for a gig of DRAM, the system is merely noting, I want a gig of DRAM. If you don't use it, the system can make use of the gig that you didn't use somewhere else, cache and so on. So this is a model that was pioneered by FreeBSD jails. It was taken to the logical extreme by Solaris Zones, and then it was aped, which is to say imitated very poorly, by Linux containers. And I should really put containers in air quotes there, and I'll talk why in just a second. In terms of OSL virtualization at Joyent, so I'm the CTO of Joyent, we are a cloud computing provider. Our most core belief, yes, we're the company behind Node.js and so on, but our most core belief is in OS-based virtualization. We've been doing this since our inception, since 2006. We've been running OS containers in production. We actually added support. I added support along with 2 other engineers for hardware-level virtualization in 2011. And this was basically like someone going to work in a sausage factory and coming out a vegetarian. After I saw the actual horrors that go into hardware-level virtualization, I came out believing more strongly than ever in OS-based virtualization, especially as services get small, especially as you move towards microservices. You need to have OS-based virtualization. And so we've been a big believer in this. We've always emphasized their operational characteristics, but for a very long time, we were a very lone voice. Meanwhile, the folks saw in the broader world, saw they could use containers as a foundation for building a PaaS. And there are a couple of PaaS vendors, one in particular, that really embraced OS-level virtualization to build their PaaS. And a PaaS that you may or may not have heard of called .cloud built this PaaS using OS-level virtualization. PaaS wasn't terribly interesting, but people were actually really interested in the actual orchestration layer they had built. People were really interested in Docker. And this is the moment in this Docker YouTube video in which Solomon Hykes, CTO of Docker, announces Docker to the world. This is in 2013, early 2013. And people didn't care about .cloud, did care a lot about Docker, embraced Docker, and Docker went off to the races. Docker, and the Docker revolution is real. Docker may provoke the same kind of rage reaction that microservices provokes in Kelly, and for good reasons, but know that there is there, absolutely. Because Docker has used actually a different attribute of OS-based virtualization that we didn't consider as strongly, namely the ability to provision very rapidly. You're not spinning up a whole virtual machine. You're just spinning up a little container. It's much faster. So they actually use the ability to provision rapidly to iterate quickly for developers. And developers we can build these services really quickly. We can build layers. I can pull from yours. You can pull from mine. And we can begin to think operationally. And what we end up with at the end is a container that we can then ship into production. And we can run exactly in production what we're running on our laptop, and vice versa. When you get something in production, I can now run what's in production on my laptop. We're living the dream. And developers, we have taken off with Docker. It's a tremendous revolution for developers because you can do this reliably, so quickly, and so on, and it very much complements the ethos of microservices. And as I've been known to say, that Docker will do to apt what apt did to tar. Apt is the packaging framework, or Yum, whatever, pick your favorite packaging system for Linux. tar, CPIO, is still at the heart of those packaging systems, but we don't think of CPIO and tar anymore. We think in terms of apt or yum or what have you. We're not going to think in terms of apt or yum in the future. We're going to think in terms of images. Probably Docker images, other images too. But Docker is up-leveling the abstraction in a very important way. There's a broader container revolution afoot. So Docker has pointed us to the future, and now a lot of people get it. Like, oh, great, okay, that's terrific, everyone gets it. But now everyone's like, okay, we get it. Boy, we love containers, but boy, we can't be made to be secure in production. Like, oh, okay, yes. All right, we've been doing this for a while, as it turns out. You can actually make this secure and in production, but you can't do it on the Linux substrate. It is true that the Linux substrate actually is insecure by design. It was actually designed to imitate these other systems. It wasn't designed to be secure, and multi-tenant security is a challenge. And Linux, by the way, has no notion of containers. They've got namespaces and C groups upon which containers are built. So people are saying, well, okay, that's fine, that's not secure, but what we'll do is we will run our containers inside of VMs. Don't do this. God is very upset that we're doing this. God is going to collectively punish us all. We are all going to have to survive Judgment Day because people are running, I don't want to name names, but there are a lot of people that are running containers inside of VMs. Please don't do this. Please don't do this, because this undermines the promise of containers. We need to be able to run containers directly on the metal to realize their economic advantage. Okay, so how do we get to container native infrastructure? Well, we in SmartOS, we've had containers for a long time. We've deployed them into production for a long time. So we asked ourselves the question a year and a half ago, can we achieve this ideal world where we take things that people like about Docker and the actual production deployment model of SmartOS and combine them? Get the agility of Docker, the production-proven security of SmartOS on the metal performance of SmartOS. Okay, that sounds great. All right, let's do it. Go team. Well, there's some obvious obstacles. Obstacle number one, Docker is, well, not designed to be Linux-centric. The reality is that Docker is a Linux-based technology, and the encyclopedia of Docker images are all Linux binaries. And SmartOS is Unix, but it isn't Linux. And to explain the difference, if you go on, you can go watch my history hour explaining the long and tortured history of the Unix wars, but suffice it to say, these things are different. Now, fortunately, Linux itself is really actually only a kernel. The Linux does not actually extend what you think of Linux in terms of all the GNU tooling and so on, is not what Torvalds defines Linux to be. Torvalds defines Linux to be only the kernel. I actually disagree with him on this point, but it's very useful to us because if Linux is only the kernel, that means I can present a Linux system call table, and if I can be convincing about the way that I present that Linux system call table, you actually don't have a way of knowing the difference, and you can actually run Linux binaries natively in a SmartOS container. So to do this, we resurrected an old Sun technology called L-expanded zones, and we began to just swing the hammer on this. And again, this is a year and change ago, and this is a tweet when we finally got all this stuff working towards the end of last year. This is a tweet where someone is running XFCE. I don't even know what the hell that is. I guess that's software. Firefox, Skype on Ubuntu 14.04 running on SmartOS, and they're running dtrace, which is a SmartOS-based technology. The running dtrace allows you to instrument your production apps in this terminal over here. You can't quite make it out, but they're running dtrace over there. So they're actually getting the best of all worlds. And from our perspective, we've lived the value of zones in production. We've lived the value of ZFS. We've lived the value of dtrace. So we understand the value of this. But sometimes you throw this stuff out there and you're like, I don't know if people are going to care or not. Turns out they actually do care. And this is a sampling of one of the many tweets in response to this. I can't show my kids this because this is the kind of out of the box thinking in terms of inventing new swear words that my kids are constantly experimenting with. And to introduce this term to them would be to drop a match into a dry prairie under high wind, and my house would be an inferno of shitballs. So I appreciate you in advance for not sharing this with my kids. But I think it does express that people get it. Wow, this is amazing. Okay, so that problem is licked now, and we are running binaries convincingly and so on, and it's Linux. Great. Now we're running Linux securely in production. Next problem, how do we provision these things? Because the Docker daemon actually is actually the way Docker containers get provisioned. And if you've used Docker, it may take you a while to figure this out. If you've never used Docker, I'm going to jumpstart you a little bit. And when you figure this out, you'll know it's actually not you. It actually is the way it works. The Docker, you'll go looking for the Docker server. Well, there is no Docker server. There's a Docker binary that you can run as both the client and the server. A little goofy, but it's fine. So this Docker binary functions as both the client and the server, and there's just no way that we're going to run that in our provisioning path as a cloud provider. Because if you're in the global zone on us, you're on that control plane, you can delete the company. So we're kind of not so into like downloading stuff off the internet and running it there. Just not so into that. Like, oh, file an issue on GitHub. It's like, oh, file, my company got deleted. I don't think I want to do that. So for us, we need to be very, very rigid about what's in that control plane. And that but as we took this apart, we realized we have to do it a different way. This doesn't make any sense. And fortunately, we found actually a jewel kind of hidden in there. That yes, Docker is one binary that communicates to itself, but the API that it uses is actually pretty good. And if you're at this conference, I assume you know the value of a good API versus a bad API, right? You wade in and you can see if an API has suffered unspeakable pain, and out of that pain has come actually a decent API. Because I don't think anyone develops a good API, by the way, by scratch. I think the only way to actually develop a good API is through suffering. I'm an API Calvinist in this regard. I believe that actually suffering is API salvation. Not to get too theological on you, but we found the Docker Remote API was actually a really good API. It had versioning and so on. That's always a good sign. It's like realizing that there's actually kind of running sewers and so on, running water when you arrive. Good. We got versioning and so on. It's expressive. It's robust. So what we could actually go do is actually implement a Docker Remote API endpoint for Smart Data Center. Smart Data Center is our orchestration software that we run our public cloud on. We actually open sourced it all last year. We got a bunch of customers that also run it on-prem. So you can run it on-prem. You can run it on the cloud. And we open source that whole kit and caboodle. But so if we took Smart Data Center, we could add a Docker Remote API endpoint to it, and that's what we did with this thing called Triton. So in March, we launched Triton, and Triton is Smart Data Center plus a Docker Remote API endpoint. Now, when we did this, there was one little catch, one thing we were a little bit nervous about, because if you've used Docker, there's a notion of a Docker host. A Docker host is a virtual machine on which you're running Docker containers. By implementing that remote API at the data center level, the idea of the host becomes virtualized. There's not a physical host. So instead of actually provisioning your Docker containers on an actual VM and making God angry, I hasten to add, instead of actually provisioning on a VM, you are provisioning them on what is the entire data center. Now your Docker client feels that it's provisioning it on a VM. It just looks like a big machine because it's an entire data center. And so a big question we had is like, is this going to be acceptable or not? Are people going to be, I hope people aren't going to be too upset about this. So we started to ask people, like, you've used Docker, like, how would you feel if the Docker hosts were virtualized, it's our data center? And people are like, yeah, where do I get that? Like, what is that? It's like, well, are you angry? I can't quite tell. Do you want to get it because you want to hurt it? Or are you actually happy? But it's like, no, I want that because I want to get out of this nonsense of managing VMs. Now, people want to get out of the nonsense of managing VMs, not because of the angering of God, which doesn't seem to bother anybody, but they want to get out of it because it's just another thing to deal with. It's another thing to manage. It's another layer that you've got to go allocate. And when your containers grow, like, oh, I got to go allocate a bunch more VMs before I can allocate containers. People hate that. It's just annoying. And to be able to just allocate a container on entire DC is actually a much cleaner, better answer. So we actually, we were elated to discover this because we didn't have a choice, so I'm glad people feel that way. But we actually put this into production, into early access production in March, and we're moving towards the general availability very, very soon now. And I think actually I've got just a minute or two I can show you what this looks like. So actually I'm gonna run, hopefully folks can see this. I'm just going to run Docker info, or did run Docker info there. Let me go clear that. What I've done is I have a couple of environment variables set, and in particular, I've got a couple environment variables, and I've just pointed myself, my Docker host, at the actual DC. So I pointed my Docker host at a DC in Ashburn, Virginia, and if I run Docker info, Docker thinks that it is talking to a Docker daemon. And it's not talking to a Docker daemon at all, it's talking to this actual API service. And they've actually cleaned up some of this stuff. It used to say, like, the Docker client would ask you, what Go version are you on? And we're like, what do I say? I'm written in Node. It's like, I had to make something up, like 42. We're 42. Like, all right, 42, good. Hey, great, what operating system are you? It's like, I don't know, just make something up, just lie, it doesn't know. All right, so we're on Smart Data Center as our operating system. All right, moving right along. Like, can we get through these questions a little faster, please? So Docker info is totally virtualized, but if I run Docker PS, as you may be accustomed to doing on your laptop, and of course, talk about angering God, I've got to make my terminal very, very wide to run Docker PS. And like the containers in VM thing, like God might be able to look past that one, but the 80 columns thing, God is really angry about. I'm running Docker PS. I can't even make my terminal wide enough to hold this thing. I mean, how ridiculous is this? All right, I'm gonna make my terminal even wider. All right, there we go. So now I can see Docker PS in a way that looks somewhat reasonable. And I can see that I've got all these things running. And again, these are across the entire data center. And I can run all my usual commands that you might be interested in running. I can run Docker inspect. I can see, this is running, I think that one is like the Google Hello World thing. So I can actually now note that I actually have a proper IP address. If you haven't used Docker, you would just say, well, of course you have a proper IP address. If you have used Docker, you're like, oh my God, clean water. I had no idea. Because if you've used Docker, you actually don't get an IP address normally. You get like a port, and this is crazy port madness. If you don't know about it, I don't want to be the one to break this news to you. But if you're used to having an IP address, which by the way is a good idea, you actually have a proper IP address. And then I can actually log into this thing if I want. So I'm actually going to log into this guy. And let me go, I'll go Docker exec. Actually, I'll go pick my Debian Jessie container. And of course, it would be nice if I actually do the arguments in the right order. And what I'm going to do is actually log into this container. And we'll see a bash prompt here in a second. So now I am logged into this container, again, in this data center in US East. And in terms of the uname, if you run uname on this guy, it's going to say, oh yeah, I'm Linux, it's cool, you've got proc there, whatever, you're Linux. But by the way, you're not exactly Linux. And if you go over into /native, we've actually hidden all of the actual SmartOS native system in /native. So if you want, you can actually run, for example, dtrace on your Linux binary. So I'll just run dtrace, we'll do dtrace -s, lx. I'll run all Linux system calls, for example. And if you haven't seen dtrace before, this might look like line noise, but suffice it to say that this is aggregating all system calls as they happen. It would be very, very nice if I actually invoke dtrace properly. You think I would actually be able to do that by now. And if in another window, if I actually log into this guy, I would actually see, and let me go do that, I would actually see that we are able to see the system calls as they happen. So you're getting kind of the best of all worlds. You're getting the Linux world that you're used to having. If I Control-C this, I assume I'll see only bash. Damn it. You know, these containers are now so slimmed down, they make for very poor demos. It used to be, you run this on Ubuntu 14.04, and the thing runs like 150 processes when you log in. But damn this container revolution and their slim containers. These things are actually much slimmer than they used to be. All right, but anyway, you get the gist, albeit with a kind of a somewhat unimpressive demo that is just bash doing system calls there. So to kind of wrap up here, we've done this and we've deployed it into production. In terms of the landscape of containers, very, very clear that for microservices especially, containers are the future of development. No question about that. What is unclear is the upstack ramifications. We actually don't know what's going to happen upstack. Is it going to be Kubernetes? Is it going to be Mesos? Kubernetes, Mesos, these things even compete with one another? You can't get a straight answer out of anybody. Even the folks that are behind these projects, because they themselves actually don't know. They don't know how these things are going to shake out. There are some things that are complementary about it, some things that are not complementary about it. Everything is open source, which is kind of a crazy dynamic. It's unlikely to be winner take all. There is going to be mutation, absolutely. And there's going to be framework wars for a while. You can expect Hacker News flame wars to continue. We at Triton Joyent, we've taken a very modular approach. We are providing just that base platform. So whether it ends up being Kubernetes or what have you, we don't want to force that choice on anybody. In terms of the future of containers, you need not compromise. You can have multi-tenant security, you can have operational elasticity, and on the metal performance, but we've got to get rid of that VM layer that's in the middle. With that, thank you very much.